December 16, 1944. Bastogne, Belgium. The Ardennes forest lay buried under heavy snow, a blinding white expanse stretching as far as the eye could see. Trees, stripped bare of their leaves, stood like skeletal sentinels, their branches weighed down by ice. The wind howled through the forest, carrying snow in sharp, cutting gusts that made exposed skin sting as if it were being pricked by needles. The temperature hovered around degrees C, and frostbite was a constant, invisible enemy. Private First Class Daniel Riley, 22 years old and a radio operator with the 101st Airborne Division, huddled inside a makeshift command post built from sandbags and the remnants of a bombed-out farmhouse. His hands shook, not from fear, though fear was certainly present, but from the cold, his fingers barely able to manipulate the tiny knobs and switches on his radio set. Every day since the German offensive had begun, Riley had sat in this cramped, frozen space, transmitting messages, receiving fragmented intelligence and watching his comrades fight and die under conditions no human should endure. The German assault had been swift, ruthless, and merciless. Bastogne, a small crossroads town of little strategic importance in peacetime, had become the fulcrum of a titanic battle. The Wehrmacht had launched its last major winter offensive, the operation they would call WWII, the Ardennes Offensive. Their plan was audacious: punch through the thinly defended American lines, split the Allied forces, and capture Antwerp, cutting supply lines and throwing the entire front into chaos. But Bastogne, fortified only by airborne units unprepared for a full mechanized assault, was their immediate obstacle. Daniel had arrived in Bastogne just days before the assault began, full of optimism and the naive certainty that war could be managed with discipline and training. That certainty had evaporated like steam rising from a frozen stream. Reports had come in constantly: villages overrun, supply columns destroyed, tanks immobilized, artillery positions silenced. By December 18th, the 101st was encircled. No reinforcements could reach them. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies were dwindling. Frostbite claimed more victims than bullets, and the dead were piling up faster than they could be buried. Riley checked his radio again. Static hissed, then a voice broke through, fragmented, barely intelligible. Bastogne hold, resupply incoming, maybe, artillery. The message cut out mid-sentence. Frustration boiled in his chest. Every transmission was a struggle, and every struggle was amplified by the knowledge that lives depended on him maintaining contact. Outside, the town had become a frozen battlefield. Artillery craters filled with ice, collapsed barns smoldering faintly where they hadn't been completely destroyed, streets clogged with wrecked vehicles. He remembered the first day of the siege. German tanks had rolled into the Ardennes with terrifying precision, their guns cutting through American armor as if it were cardboard. Infantry units tried to hold roads, but machine gun fire and mortars cut them down. Riley had watched from his perch in a ruined building as a jeep carrying a group of paratroopers was shredded by enemy fire. The explosion had thrown men across the snow, and Riley could only cover his mouth to stifle a scream. No one had survived. That memory haunted him daily. Across the command post, Lieutenant Marcus Thornton, Riley's officer, paced back and forth, muttering to himself. Thornton was a tall man with a wiry frame, dark hair flecked with gray, and eyes that had seen too much. He had a reputation for brilliance in strategy, but brilliance was meaningless when your men were starving, freezing, and trapped in a snowbound town surrounded by an enemy that outnumbered you 3-1. "We're running out of options, Dan," Thornton said, his voice low but urgent. "Radio traffic is sporadic at best. The Germans are jamming signals. Half the town's perimeter is on fire. If we don't get supplies soon, Bastogne is finished." Riley didn't respond immediately. He was focused on the dials, the knobs, the fragile connection to a world that seemed impossibly distant. "I know, sir," he said finally, his voice tight. "But if we can maintain communication with the artillery units and coordinate with the forward observers, we might still have a chance to hold the crossroads." Thornton ran a hand through his hair. "We've tried that, Riley. The Germans are smart. They're anticipating every move. They know how to use the terrain, the snow, even the fog to mask their movements. Our observers can't get a clear line, and the men at the front are exhausted. Half of them are frozen stiff or in shock. Orders aren't enough. We need something different, something nobody expects." Daniel knew what he was thinking, though he didn't say it. He'd been thinking it too. The conventional strategies, the ones drilled into them in training, weren't working. They couldn't rely on reinforcements, couldn't depend on supply convoys, and couldn't predict enemy behavior. The Germans had them surrounded, and they were using the weather and the terrain like weapons. But Riley had a different kind of thinking. As a radio operator, he wasn't just trained in sending and receiving messages. He was trained to improvise, to adapt, to create solutions out of broken equipment and limited resources. He had fixed radios with parts scavenged from dead vehicles, jury-rigged antennas, and coaxed signals through snowstorms and static. If anyone could think of a way to turn the tide, it might be him. The opportunity, or the spark of an idea, came later that night. Riley had been scanning the frequencies, trying to find a channel free from German interference. His hands were red from the cold, and his boots were stiff with ice. The wind outside shrieked against the broken windows of the farmhouse. He closed his eyes briefly and imagined the battlefield as a grid, every building, every road, every tree, every frozen pond. He imagined the Germans moving, their artillery, their armored units. Then it hit him, the one thing the Germans couldn't anticipate. They relied on conventional communications, predictable logistics, and clear lines of attack. But if someone could create a network that moved faster than them, that couldn't be intercepted, that could guide supply and artillery dynamically, they could change the game. It was reckless. It was insane. It might even get him killed, but it just might work. Riley began sketching furiously on a scrap piece of paper, using a stub of pencil he had found in the ruins. He drew antennas, relays, jeep-mounted radios, signal paths that zigzagged through the town and out into the forest. He imagined using damaged equipment, radios from wrecked vehicles, spare batteries, salvaged cables, to build a mobile, decentralized communications network. One that could move like a ghost, always in the right place at the right time, invisible to the enemy. He called it in his mind the radio ghost. The first thought of building it made him grin despite the frostbite creeping into his fingers. It wasn't enough to just have radios. He would need volunteers, men willing to risk exposure in the snow and under fire. He would need vehicles that could move silently, mechanics who could modify the radios on the fly, and a plan so precise that it worked in the chaos of battle. And most of all, he would need someone crazy enough to approve it. By dawn, he had a rough plan. The radio ghost would be a network of jeep-mounted, portable relay stations, each one operated by a team of 2 soldiers. The jeeps would drive into positions just beyond the reach of enemy fire, set up antennas, and relay messages back and forth from the command post to the artillery units, to the infantry at the front, and to supply depots outside the encirclement. The network would be constantly shifting, always moving, always ghost-like, impossible to jam completely. He presented the idea to Lieutenant Thornton that morning. "Sir," he said, handing over his sketch, "I know it sounds insane, but I think we can create a mobile communications network. We call it the Radio Ghost. It'll allow us to coordinate artillery and guide supply convoys without the Germans intercepting or predicting our moves." Thornton stared at the paper for a long moment, then looked up at Riley. "You're a radio operator, not an engineer. You want to put men in jeeps into the middle of a battlefield they're surrounded in, and trust that your improvised network will work." "Yes, sir," Riley replied. "It's risky, but if it works we might hold Bastogne, we might save lives, and we might actually keep the town from falling." Thornton was silent. He considered the map of Bastogne, the supply routes, the artillery positions, the snow-choked roads. Every conventional tactic had failed. Every predictable strategy had been countered by the Germans. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, Riley, "You've got 48 hours. Build this radio ghost. If it fails, people will die. If it succeeds, we just might live. And the army might never forgive us if it fails." Riley saluted, the chill of the morning biting into his frozen skin. He felt the weight of every man in Bastogne on his shoulders, but also the first flicker of hope he had seen in days. He was no hero. He was just a radio operator, a kid from Boston who had learned to fix broken equipment and coax signals out of static. But sometimes that was enough. The work began immediately. He scoured the ruined town for radios, batteries, spare cables, and broken antennas. He recruited a small team: Corporal James Avery, a mechanic who could rebuild a radio from wire and tin; Private First Class Louis Martinez, a driver with nerves of steel; and Sergeant Henry Thompson, a communications officer who could improvise encryption and routing in minutes. Together, they began turning scrap and ingenuity into a weapon that the Germans could not predict. By nightfall, the first Jeep-mounted relay station was operational. Static filled the airwaves, then suddenly a clear voice emerged. "Command, this is forward relay. Coordinates received. Over." It was a small victory, but in Bastogne, small victories were everything. Outside, the wind howled, the snow drifted, and the encircled soldiers huddled in frozen trenches, unaware that a small team of men had begun crafting a ghost that would haunt the German offensive for the next 2 weeks. And so it began. The night Bastogne might have fallen, the night a radio operator's audacity would give the 101st Airborne a chance to survive. The night air in Bastogne was merciless. Snow fell in thick, icy sheets, coating every building, every vehicle, every soldier in a frozen, blinding white. The wind had picked up, howling like a wounded animal through the empty streets, carrying with it the distant thud of artillery and the faint crack of small arms fire. Daniel Riley rubbed his frostbitten hands together, staring at the makeshift map sprawled across a table inside the battered farmhouse command post. Every line, every arrow, every marker represented a life, friend or enemy. It hardly mattered, and every decision could tilt the fragile balance between survival and annihilation. The radio ghost was no longer a sketch on a scrap of paper. It was real. 4 Jeep-mounted relay stations had been assembled from scavenged parts: broken radios, twisted antennas, engines that coughed and spat but still ran, and men who had been staring death in the face for days. Corporal Avery, with grease smudged across his face and hands blackened by engine oil, checked each connection meticulously. Private Martinez tuned the antennas, adjusting for the snowstorm's interference, while Sergeant Thompson ensured that the signal paths were encrypted, unpredictable, and mobile. Riley himself crouched over a field radio, a bulky relic of another era that had been coaxed back to life by Avery's skilled hands. His fingers trembled, partly from the cold, partly from anticipation. The first true test of the radio ghost would occur tonight. Messages would flow from the command post to the forward units, guiding artillery strikes and coordinating the delivery of desperately needed supplies. If it worked, it could change the tide of the siege. If it failed, men would die. "Riley," Thompson said, his voice low and calm, "we're ready. Stations Alpha through Delta are in position, all channels operational. No interference detected so far. You're up." Daniel nodded, swallowed the lump of fear lodged in his throat, and keyed the microphone. "Command to Relay Alpha. Read me. Over." Static hissed. For a moment there was nothing but the high-pitched whine of the storm. Then a voice, sharp and clipped, broke through. "Relay Alpha reading you loud and clear. Coordinates confirmed. Over." Relief washed over him, brief and fragile. "Relay Alpha, maintain position. Begin routing messages to the forward artillery units. Over." "Roger, command. Routing now. Out." It was working. The radio ghost had taken its first breath. Riley felt a surge of triumph but tempered it with caution. Out there in the snow and darkness, the German forces prowled, hunting every signal, every movement, every mistake. One misstep, one intercepted transmission, and the entire operation could collapse. Outside, the first real test came almost immediately. A patrol of German infantry, moving through the outskirts of town, spotted Relay Alpha's jeep, its engine softly humming in the frozen silence. Gunfire erupted. Corporal Avery and Private Martinez returned fire from behind the jeep, rifles spitting lead into the dark, their bullets cracking through the icy air. The patrol hesitated, unsure of the source, before retreating into the forest. "Status," Riley barked into the microphone. Relay Alpha reported, "Holding position. Minor engagement, no casualties. Resuming signal relay. Over." It was a small victory, but in Bastogne, small victories were survival. Riley leaned back, letting himself breathe for a moment, knowing full well that the next test would be far worse. The following day, the radio ghost truly proved its worth. German artillery had begun targeting supply routes with deadly precision. Columns of trucks attempting to deliver ammunition and food were shredded before they could reach the encircled troops. Riley's team received a desperate call from a forward unit trapped in a burned-out building near the crossroads. "Command, supply convoy pinned down. We can't hold much longer. Over." Riley's mind raced. Using conventional tactics would be suicidal, but the radio ghost offered something no ordinary operation could: mobility, unpredictability, and speed. He keyed his radio. "Forward units, listen carefully. We're establishing a new relay network. Coordinates incoming. Supplies will be guided directly to your position. Maintain radio discipline. Over." For the next several hours, Riley and his team orchestrated a delicate dance of signals. Jeeps moved silently through snowdrifts, antennas raised and lowered, transmissions rerouted on the fly. Every message was a gamble, every adjustment a calculation in a deadly equation. The German artillery crews fired blindly, unable to anticipate the movements of the ghostly network guiding American forces. By nightfall, the supply convoy arrived. The soldiers had been starving, ammunition depleted, morale fraying at the edges. When the trucks finally rumbled into position, guided by the invisible hands of the radio ghost, cheers erupted, a rare, spontaneous sound that cut through the relentless storm. Men hugged, shook hands, and laughed, even as snow fell around them like a benediction. But victory was fleeting. The Germans were relentless. They began targeting areas where the jeeps had been spotted, sending patrols and reconnaissance units to track the signals. Riley realized that for every triumph, they were planting seeds of new dangers. The radio ghost had to evolve, to adapt faster than the enemy could react. Over the next several days, Riley's ingenuity became legendary among the 101st. Jeeps were equipped with concealed antennas, camouflage nets, and even decoys, burnt-out vehicles wired with old radios to broadcast fake transmissions. Routes were changed hourly, sometimes even more frequently, to confuse German intelligence. Messages were encrypted in ways that only Riley and Thompson could decipher, bouncing through relay points in patterns designed to resemble random static. Yet the strain was immense. Frostbite, exhaustion, and hunger took their toll on every member of the team. Martinez's hands were cracked and bleeding, Avery's eyes burned from staring at dials for hours on end, and Thompson moved with a weariness that suggested he might collapse at any moment. Riley himself felt his body slipping into the same state, the cold gnawing at his bones, sleep a distant memory, fear a constant companion. But there was no choice. The radio ghost had to survive. Bastogne had to survive. Then came the night that would cement the legend. German forces launched a concentrated attack on the northwestern perimeter, aiming to break through the defenses and capture the crossroads. Riley's radios crackled with the frantic voices of the frontline units. "Command, they're coming. Artillery is falling short. We're outnumbered. Over." Riley's mind worked with the precision of a machine. "Relay Bravo, redirect signal to Artillery Unit Charlie. Adjust coordinates by 45 degrees. Forward unit, hold position until support arrives. Over." The relay stations flickered and moved like shadows across the snow, transmitting commands that shifted artillery fire with surgical precision. Shells fell around the German advance, targeting supply lines, machine gun nests, and armored vehicles. For the first time, Riley saw the effect of his ghostly network in real time. Enemy soldiers thrown into confusion, their advance stalled, their cohesion broken. By dawn, the attack had been repelled. Bastogne still stood. Exhausted men, battered by snow, hunger, and fire, stumbled through the streets, their faces pale but determined. The radio ghost had proved its worth. Daniel Riley, once just a radio operator, had become the invisible hand guiding the 101st Airborne, a force unseen but deeply felt. As he collapsed in the command post, sleep finally overtaking him, Riley thought of the cost. Men had died, others had suffered, and the siege was far from over. But in that fleeting moment, he allowed himself a spark of hope. The radio ghost had become more than a tool. It had become a symbol of defiance, ingenuity, and survival. And in a war defined by chaos and death, that symbol might just be the thing that kept Bastogne alive. Outside, the wind continued to howl, snow continued to fall, and the German forces regrouped for their next attempt. But inside the battered farmhouse, a ghost whispered through the cold, frozen streets of Bastogne, unseen and unstoppable, guiding the men who refused to surrender. The days in Bastogne were measured not in hours or minutes, but in snowdrifts, gunfire, and the brittle crackle of static over the radios. The siege tightened like a vice. German forces, shaken by the radio ghost's success, had learned fast. They were no longer merely probing the outskirts. They were calculating, coordinating, and concentrating their assaults with deadly efficiency. Riley could feel the pressure with every static-laden transmission, every flurry of messages relayed through the ghost network. Command, we have enemy armor approaching from the northwest. Reports of 2 Panzer IVs, unknown if more behind them. Infantry spread along hedgerows. Over. The voice crackled from Relay Delta. Riley's heart sank. Bastogne had seen tanks before, but the Panzer IV was a different beast entirely. Faster, more heavily armored, and paired with experienced crews, it could cut through Sherman lines in minutes if unchecked. Yet Riley knew the Ghost could give them an advantage, if it was used correctly. Relay Delta, maintain position. Redirect signal to artillery units Alpha and Bravo. Use predesignated kill zones. Infantry, fall back to secondary positions while maintaining anti-tank coverage. Over. A silence followed, broken only by the intermittent hum of the jeeps and the howl of the wind. Then, acknowledged, executing now. Over. Outside, the snow obscured everything. Visibility was down to barely 50 feet, and the Panzer crews would have to rely on sound and intuition to locate targets. That worked in Bastogne's favor. Riley's ghost network guided the American units with a precision that no human observer could replicate. Artillery strikes fell almost prophetically, scattering German infantry and creating lethal zones the armored units had to navigate. Corporal Avery, riding in one of the jeep relays, watched the snow swirl around him. "Sir," he said, frost rimming his eyebrows, "the panzers are still moving. Our rounds are hitting the infantry, but they're inching forward, taking cover, staying behind buildings. The jeeps are exposed if they notice." Riley didn't respond immediately. He ran through the possibilities in his head, calculating angles, distances, and timing. The snow and wind could mask the sound of his transmissions, but only just. If even one relay jeep was destroyed, a portion of the artillery units could lose guidance, and the Germans could exploit the gap. "Switch to staggered relays," Riley ordered. "Jeep A moves 50 meters east, B falls back 10 meters, Delta holds. Signal pattern Delta Alpha Bravo. Over." Avery adjusted the steering, guiding the jeep into a shallow ditch to remain hidden. Martinez crouched beside him, tuning the frequencies. "Copy that command. Adjusting." The night seemed endless. The Germans tested every weak point, probing with small arms, artillery, and armored vehicles. Riley's team adapted in real time, redirecting transmissions, swapping frequencies, and keeping the flow of communication uninterrupted. Every time the enemy tried to jam a signal, the Ghost responded, shifting nodes, hiding in plain sight. Hours passed. The first Panzer IV came into view, its turret slicing slowly across the snowy streets. The gunner spotted a Sherman in the distance, aimed at a predesignated kill zone. Riley keyed the microphone, hands numb from the cold. "Forward unit, do not engage directly. Wait for artillery confirmation. Over." The Sherman crew hesitated for a fraction of a second, then complied. The snow muffled their engines, blending them into the terrain. The Panzer fired, sending a shell skimming over the snow and buildings, striking a supply truck instead. Smoke and fire erupted, but the Ghost's network had predicted the trajectory, and the American units were already repositioning. The 2nd Panzer advanced more cautiously, using infantry to cover its approach. Riley observed the map, plotting a lethal intercept. "Relay Bravo," he said. "Adjust coordinates to grid 37X, fire on my mark. Infantry, reposition to secondary hedgerow. Over." Seconds stretched into eternity. Then the artillery units responded with precision. Explosions erupted around the German armor, forcing the Panzer crews to retreat behind snowbanks and abandoned buildings. The Ghost network had not only preserved American lives, but had also turned the battlefield into a maze the Germans could not navigate efficiently. By dawn, the siege had intensified but held firm. Riley's team was exhausted, frostbitten, and close to breaking, but they had bought the American forces a critical reprieve. Supplies had been delivered, positions maintained, and the German advance stalled. Yet Riley knew the Germans would escalate. Bastogne could not survive indefinitely on ingenuity alone. Brute force was coming, and the Ghost would be tested like never before. Night in Bastogne was not merely darkness, it was a predator. The snow-muffled sound reflected light and hid movement, but it also amplified fear. Every shadow could conceal a sniper, every distant crack of ice on a roof could signal an ambush. The town, already battered and frozen, had become a cage for its defenders, a place where survival depended on vigilance, improvisation, and timing. Riley crouched behind a collapsed wall near the town square, his breath fogging in the bitter air. The radio Ghost had been working tirelessly, but even the most sophisticated network could not predict instinct, desperation, or sheer audacity. And tonight, the Germans would exploit all three. "Sir," whispered Corporal Avery, frost rimming his eyebrows, "movement in Sector Charlie. Looks like infantry, maybe a platoon." Riley's eyes narrowed. He had anticipated probes, but a full platoon under cover of night meant the Germans were escalating. They had learned from the day's failures, and now they were testing the Ghost's limits. "Relay Delta, mark grid 45X, do not fire until confirmation. Maintain stealth." Riley's voice was low, precise. The Ghost would carry the instructions instantly, ensuring that artillery, armor, and infantry could coordinate without exposing themselves prematurely. Through the swirling snow, the German platoon advanced cautiously, weapons at the ready, moving like shadows. Riley's pulse accelerated. If the Ghost failed now, American positions could be overrun before reinforcements arrived. "Command, Panzer signals detected. 2 tanks moving east, supporting infantry." Avery's whisper was tense. The snow limited visibility, but the sensors, scavenged from captured German communications gear and integrated into the Ghost network, had picked up faint transmissions from German tank radios. Riley's mind raced. He had mapped kill zones, coordinated artillery strikes, and rehearsed contingencies, but nothing could replace real-time decisions. "Forward units, fall back 50 meters to secondary positions. Maintain line of sight. Do not engage tanks directly. Let Ghost guide them into the traps." Outside, the 1st Panzer IV crested a snowbank, its headlights reflecting off the frozen streets. The German crew, confident in the cover of night, assumed the Americans were pinned. They were wrong. Using the Ghost, Riley directed the American artillery with near telepathic precision. Mines concealed beneath snowbanks, pre-positioned anti-tank weapons, and Sherman units awaiting in ambush were all synchronized. Every action fed back into the network, allowing the Ghost to adapt dynamically to German movement. A shell exploded near the Panzer's tracks, throwing the crew off balance. Smoke billowed, flames licked the sides, and the German soldiers scrambling around the vehicle were forced to retreat. Riley felt the tension in his chest ease slightly. One tank neutralized, one platoon stalled, but the night was far from over. "Sir, new contact," Martinez hissed, pointing to a dark alley. "Enemy sappers, trying to plant charges on the barracks." Riley cursed under his breath. The barracks were critical for command and communication. If they fell, the Ghost network would be severely disrupted. Delta Relay, send overwatch to roof coordinates. Infantry, engage only if sappers are within 10 meters. Maintain stealth. Over. The night became a symphony of controlled chaos. Explosions echoed off frozen buildings. Muffled gunfire punctuated the darkness, and the Ghost network hummed quietly, coordinating movements with a precision no human commander could achieve alone. Time seemed to distort. Minutes stretched into hours. Riley Wright's team worked tirelessly, routing transmissions, adjusting artillery, and predicting enemy maneuvers. Every decision had consequences measured in seconds, lives, and the fragile survival of Bastogne. Suddenly, the snow parted to reveal a German half-track attempting to flank the southern sector. Riley Wright's pulse spiked. The Ghost had accounted for infantry and tanks, but mechanized units introduced unpredictable variables. "Relay Bravo, redirect focus to south sector. Fire on my mark. Infantry, reposition along western barricades. Maintain cover." A hail of artillery and pre-laid mines erupted. The half-track was caught in the kill zone, rolling violently, its wheels torn off, engines sputtering and flames licking the chassis. The soldiers inside were thrown clear, stunned, and captured by waiting infantry. For a moment, silence reigned. The German forces had underestimated the Ghost. Every attack met with precision, every maneuver countered with foresight. Riley allowed himself a brief breath, though the cold gnawed at his fingers and face. But then, from the north, a new threat emerged. A squadron of German engineers equipped with demolition charges, moving to destroy key communication hubs supporting the Ghost network. If they succeeded, all coordination could collapse, turning the night into a massacre. Riley Wright's mind raced. "Alpha Relay, intercept at Grid 22B block ingress. Infantry, move to secondary barricades immediately. Over." The engineers approached cautiously, unaware that Riley Wright's team had set subtle tripwires, activated remotely through Ghost-coordinated signals. A hidden charge detonated, sending snow, debris, and shrapnel into the air. The engineers scattered, some retreating, others captured. Hours passed in this relentless cycle. Each German advance met with Ghost-directed resistance. Riley felt the weight of fatigue pressing down, but he knew one lapse could mean disaster. The snow continued to fall, masking movement, hiding death, and giving the defenders a ghostly advantage. By 300 hours, dawn was still hours away, but the German attack slowed. Morale was faltering, soldiers exhausted, snowbound, and frustrated by the unyielding American coordination. Riley observed the map, tracking every remaining enemy unit, anticipating their desperation moves. And then, at last, the first pale light crept across Bastogne. The German forces, beaten, frozen, and demoralized, began to withdraw. Bastogne had survived the night, not through brute force alone, but through ingenuity, coordination, and the unprecedented advantage provided by the radio Ghost network. Riley leaned back, exhausted but exhilarated. He knew the siege was far from over. German forces would regroup, adapt, and attack again. But Bastogne had held, and in the shadows of snow and smoke, the Ghost had proven itself, a silent sentinel, a force multiplier, and a testament to human ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. The morning after the night assault, Bastogne lay quiet but tense. Snow crusted the streets like broken glass, reflecting the gray winter light. The town had survived the night, but survival was only the first step. Supplies were low, morale fragile, and enemy forces were regrouping beyond the horizon. Riley stood on the roof of a damaged municipal building, surveying the streets below. Soldiers moved cautiously, their breaths forming misty clouds in the frigid air. The ghost network had held, coordinating movements, artillery, and reconnaissance with precision, but victory was temporary. Bastogne had been a bottleneck. If the Germans could encircle it again, all they had endured overnight would be undone. "Sir," Corporal Avery approached, carrying a map smeared with mud and snow. "Supply lines report minimal disruption. Fuel and ammunition are still coming through, but reinforcements won't arrive for another 48 hours. We can't hold indefinitely without decisive action." Riley nodded. The numbers confirmed his fears. Bastogne could be defended, but it couldn't be held passively. They needed a breakthrough, an offensive maneuver that would push the Germans back, relieve pressure on the town, and secure critical roads leading to Luxembourg. He traced the streets with his finger. "We'll strike west. German forces are concentrated north and east. That leaves the forested corridor to the west lightly defended. We move fast, exploit the terrain, and hit their flanks before they can react. The Ghost will coordinate artillery, minefields, and infantry support. Timing is critical. No hesitation. No mistakes." By mid-morning, the plan was in motion. Infantry units moved under the cover of the Ghost-directed communications, laying ambushes along anticipated German routes. Sherman tanks, modified with additional armor and reinforced tracks for the frozen terrain, prepared to lead the assault. Artillery units took positions on high ground, their targets pre-calculated based on enemy troop movements. Riley rode with the lead Sherman, codenamed Iron Wolf, alongside Sergeant Thompson, a veteran tanker who had seen combat across France and Belgium. Thompson's eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon, noting every shadow, every movement in the trees. "The Ghost's got eyes everywhere," Riley said, adjusting his headset. "Keep the gun trained to Sector 7 Alpha. They might try to flank through the eastern ravine." Thompson grunted. "We'll be ready. Just make sure Ghost keeps feeding us updates. Last thing we need is to stumble into a hidden Panther or pack gun." The first contact came sooner than expected. Scouts reported a German infantry unit attempting to reinforce their western flank, moving through a narrow forest path. Riley directed Iron Wolf and accompanying tanks to intercept, while the infantry prepared to trap the enemy in a crossfire. The forest erupted in gunfire, the snow muffling the sounds but not the chaos. Riley watched as his coordination worked in real time. Ghost-directed artillery blocked retreat routes, infantry advanced with minimal exposure, and Sherman tanks cut off escape. By the time the engagement ended, the German unit had been captured or neutralized, and the western corridor was clear. Riley allowed himself a brief nod of satisfaction, but he knew the real challenge was ahead, the German defensive line at the ridge beyond the forest. Intelligence had identified a heavily fortified position, complete with trenches, machine gun nests, and concealed anti-tank emplacements. Previous assaults had failed, leaving dozens dead and equipment destroyed. "We're not walking into another trap," Riley said to Thompson. "Ghost will guide us. Timing, positioning, and firepower will be everything." The plan was precise. Infantry would advance first, using smoke grenades to obscure visibility. Tanks would follow, maintaining intervals calculated by Ghost to avoid bottlenecks. Artillery would fire in staggered bursts, neutralizing known positions while avoiding friendly units. Every movement was choreographed to minimize risk and maximize effect. As Iron Wolf and the accompanying tanks approached the ridge, German defenders opened fire. Machine guns barked, tracer rounds streaked the gray air, and artillery shells shook the frozen ground. Riley remained calm, feeding updates into Ghost, which adjusted artillery targeting and troop positioning in seconds. The first Sherman struck the ridge's slope, its reinforced tracks gripping the frozen earth. Smoke and snow whipped across the battlefield, masking their approach. The prongs attached to the tanks, modified based on lessons from Normandy, broke through frozen earth and debris, providing cover and creating lanes for infantry. Guns roared, artillery thundered, Ghost-directed mines detonated at precisely calculated moments, taking out concealed German positions. Within minutes, the ridge was breached, the German line fractured, and American forces were advancing into enemy-held territory for the first time in weeks. Riley allowed himself a rare smile. The breakthrough was underway, but he knew the battle was far from over. German reinforcements would arrive, and the frozen terrain could betray even the best-laid plans. Hours passed in a relentless sequence of engagements. German units attempted to regroup, launching counterattacks that were swiftly neutralized by Ghost-coordinated artillery and tactical maneuvers. Tanks moved in formation, infantry exploited breaches, and engineers disarmed mines and obstacles in real time. The battlefield was a complex machine, every part moving in synchrony, guided by Riley's coordination and the Ghost network's predictive calculations. By late afternoon, the Germans were in full retreat. Bastogne had been relieved, and the western corridor was secured. Supplies could flow freely, reinforcements could arrive, and the strategic initiative had shifted to the Americans. Exhausted soldiers collapsed in the snow, their breaths ragged, faces smeared with mud and blood. Riley surveyed the battlefield, noting both the victories and the cost. Dozens of men had fallen, equipment had been damaged, but the breakthrough had been decisive. Bastogne was no longer under immediate threat. Riley walked among the soldiers, offering words of encouragement and recognition. "You held the line. You advanced under fire. You adapted. This is what makes us stronger than the enemy, not just numbers or equipment, but coordination, courage, and ingenuity." In the days that followed, the breakthrough at Bastogne became a case study in modern warfare. Ghost-directed operations demonstrated the effectiveness of networked coordination, real-time intelligence, and adaptive tactics. Infantry, armor, artillery, and engineers worked as a single organism, each movement calculated and executed with precision. Riley's success inspired similar initiatives across the European theater. Commanders sought to replicate the coordination and predictive capacity demonstrated at Bastogne. Engineers developed mobile communication hubs, sensors were deployed to feed real-time data to command units, and doctrines were revised to incorporate integrated, networked battlefield management. For Riley, however, the victory was bittersweet. He knew that while innovation and coordination had saved Bastogne, the cost of war was inexorable. Friends had fallen, towns had been destroyed, and the human toll was immense. Yet the breakthrough had proved that ingenuity, discipline, and technology could shape outcomes, save lives, and alter the course of campaigns. As the sun set over the snow-covered town, Riley reflected on the lessons of Bastogne. War was chaos, death, and destruction, but it was also a test of human ingenuity, resilience, and courage. And in that crucible, the breakthrough had shown that even in the harshest conditions, order could emerge from chaos, and victory could be forged through ingenuity, coordination, and unyielding resolve. The morning fog clung to the Ardennes like a shroud, dense and damp, curling through the trees and drifting across the frozen fields. Soldiers in worn winter coats moved cautiously along the icy roads, boots crunching through frost-hardened mud. Riley stood on a small rise overlooking the forward positions, his breath steaming in the cold air. Intelligence reports indicated that the Germans were regrouping, preparing for a counteroffensive that could undo the gains at Bastogne. "Sir," Captain Lawrence approached, map in hand, "the enemy has consolidated forces along the Sombref Ridge. Recon reports suggest heavy armor, machine gun nests, and at least 2 artillery batteries. They're preparing to strike at dawn. If they hit our western flank, Bastogne could be cut off again. Riley's eyes narrowed. He had anticipated this. The Germans were skilled at exploiting perceived weaknesses, and the Ardennes terrain gave them advantages of concealment and mobility. But he also knew that a preemptive strike could disrupt their preparations. "We won't wait for them to dictate the terms," Riley said. "We'll hit first, hit hard, and hit with coordination. Ghost will direct the strike. Infantry, armor, artillery, and engineers, everything moves as one organism. Timing is critical. If we succeed, we'll not only prevent the counterattack but force the enemy into full retreat." The orders went out. By late afternoon, troops had repositioned. Sherman tanks, now reinforced with lessons from Bastogne, were distributed across the front. Infantry units took up concealed positions, ready to advance once the breach points were established. Engineers laid improvised defenses, including anti-tank obstacles and booby-trapped ice patches, designed to slow any unexpected German advance. As darkness fell, Riley gathered his command staff in a ruined barn, the interior lit by flickering lanterns. Maps covered every available surface, annotated with intelligence updates, predicted enemy movements and potential contingencies. "Tomorrow we strike at 4:30, Riley said, pointing to the ridge on the map. "Our goal is simple: disrupt enemy cohesion before they can launch their counteroffensive. Ghost will coordinate artillery suppression along the ridge while our infantry advances in staggered waves. Tanks will breach fortified positions and provide direct support. Engineers will neutralize minefields and obstacles in real time. We move together and we move fast. Any questions?" Lieutenant Harris, young and eager but wary, raised a hand. "Sir, what if the enemy has reserves we haven't detected? What if they flank us while we're engaged?" Riley nodded. "We've accounted for that. Ghost has deployed reconnaissance units beyond the ridge, drones where available, and patrols along secondary roads. Our mobility and coordination will allow us to adjust on the fly. Remember, hesitation will be fatal. Confidence, speed, and coordination will be our greatest weapons." By 4:30, the Ardennes lay silent. Snow muffled distant sounds, and the soldiers moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Infantry advanced under the cover of darkness, tanks followed closely, and artillery units prepared for the first salvo. The first contact was sudden and brutal. German forward scouts, attempting to delay the advance, opened fire with machine guns and mortars. Snow and debris exploded around the advancing columns, but Riley's coordination held firm. Ghost relayed real-time updates to tank commanders and infantry leaders, allowing them to adjust positions, avoid crossfire, and exploit gaps in the enemy's defenses. Riley rode with the lead Sherman, Iron Wolf II, an upgraded version of the previous Bastogne model. Its reinforced tracks and prongs, combined with improved frontal armor, allowed it to push through frozen barricades and barbed wire without exposing vulnerable points. Sergeant Thompson, still at the helm, kept the gun trained on predicted enemy positions. The first ridgeline was breached within 30 minutes. Snow and ice flew as tanks plowed through obstacles, while infantry poured into the cleared lanes, securing positions before the Germans could mount an organized defense. Artillery fire continued in precise intervals, neutralizing machine gun nests and mortar positions. Despite the initial success, the Germans were far from defeated. A sudden counterattack emerged from a concealed valley, including a Tiger tank and 2 Panzer IVs. Riley's heart pounded as he coordinated a response. Ghost calculated optimal firing angles, infantry positions, and tank maneuvers to neutralize the armored threat. The engagement was intense. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the valley, explosions shattered frozen trees, and smoke rose in thick columns. Riley observed every movement, issuing instructions that synchronized the assault like a conductor guiding an orchestra. One Sherman hit the Tiger with an armor-piercing round, immobilizing it, while Thompson's crew provided suppressive fire to cover infantry movement. After hours of relentless fighting, the German counteroffensive had been completely neutralized. The western ridge was under Allied control, and Bastonia's strategic position was secure. Riley allowed himself a brief moment of relief, knowing that their coordinated offensive had prevented a potentially catastrophic encirclement. In the aftermath, the soldiers worked to consolidate gains. Engineers repaired roads, cleared minefields, and fortified positions, while medical teams treated the wounded. Supplies were redistributed, and reinforcements moved forward to secure critical points. Riley walked among the exhausted troops, offering encouragement and assessment. "You executed the plan flawlessly. Coordination, discipline, and courage won the day. Remember this moment, the first time our integrated approach allowed us to dictate terms rather than react. This is how modern warfare is fought." The breakthrough at the Ardennes became a turning point in the broader campaign. Ghost-directed operations demonstrated the effectiveness of real-time intelligence, adaptive tactics, and integrated coordination. Commanders across the theater began to replicate the methods, incorporating lessons learned into doctrine and strategy. But Riley understood that the human cost was immense. Soldiers had endured freezing conditions, continuous combat, and the psychological strain of constant vigilance. Casualties were high, and the emotional toll left lasting scars. Yet, the success reinforced the principle that ingenuity, preparation, and coordination could shape outcomes, save lives, and alter the course of campaigns. Weeks later, Riley received commendations for his leadership and strategic innovations. Reports highlighted the Ardennes counteroffensive as an example of effective integration of infantry, armor, artillery, and engineering units. Ghost-directed tactics were formally adopted, setting a new standard for future operations. Even as recognition spread, Riley remained focused on the human element. He ensured that lessons learned were shared with commanders and troops, emphasizing adaptability, coordination, and the importance of innovation under pressure. "Victory is not just measured by territory gained," he reminded his officers, "but by the lives preserved, the mistakes avoided, and the systems improved for those who follow." The counteroffensive also reshaped the German strategy. Intelligence captured after the engagement revealed confusion and demoralization among enemy forces. The integrated approach of the Allies had disrupted supply lines, fractured command cohesion, and forced the Germans into reactive, disorganized tactics. Riley reflected on the broader implications. The battlefield was evolving. Coordination, intelligence, and innovation had become as decisive as raw firepower. The Ardennes counteroffensive illustrated that even entrenched defensive positions could be overcome with careful planning, real-time data, and decisive action. As the Allies prepared to push further into enemy territory, Riley and his teams worked tirelessly to refine tactics, improve equipment, and integrate lessons learned. The counteroffensive had been a triumph of strategy and coordination, but the war was far from over. Each engagement offered new challenges, new opportunities for innovation, and new tests of leadership and courage. Through the bitter cold, relentless combat, and high stakes, one principle had emerged clearly. In modern warfare, adaptability and ingenuity were just as essential as bravery and firepower. And those who could harness all elements, men, machines, and intelligence, would shape the outcome of battles, campaigns, and ultimately the war itself. Night fell over the dense forests of the Ardennes like a velvet curtain. The only sounds were the crunch of frost beneath boots, the occasional rustle of wildlife startled by movement, and the distant rumble of artillery echoing from the front. Lieutenant Harris crouched behind a fallen oak, peering through his binoculars at the dim shapes of German outposts scattered along the ridge. Orders had been clear: infiltrate enemy lines, gather intelligence, and, if possible, sabotage key supply routes to cripple the German counteroffensive. Harris adjusted his pack. The weight of maps, radio equipment, and rations pressed against his shoulders, a constant reminder that any misstep would be fatal. He wasn't alone. A small detachment of 10 men moved with him, their breaths slow, controlled, and synchronized. They had trained for months for this kind of operation, silent, precise, and relentless. "Remember the objective," Harris whispered. "We're shadows tonight, ghosts. Recon first, sabotage second. No unnecessary engagements. Keep your heads down, eyes open, and radios off unless necessary." The team advanced carefully, using natural cover to shield their movement. Frost-covered shrubs snapped quietly underfoot, but the darkness swallowed the sound. Every step was a test of patience and nerve. The Germans had set patrols along predictable routes, and Harris knew that even a single misstep could alert them. Hours into the trek, they reached the first target, a supply depot nestled in a narrow valley, protected by sandbagged bunkers and barbed wire. Harris signaled the team to halt. Using hand gestures, he mapped out the approach. 2 men would disable the outer alarms, 2 others would scout the guards, and Harris would lead the central infiltration team toward the munitions stockpiles. Time was critical. A full moon had risen, casting silver light over the valley. Shadows lengthened and merged, providing both concealment and risk. Harris motioned forward. The outer alarms were neutralized with precision wire cutters. The guards, unaware of the detachment's presence, continued their rounds. Harris and his team slipped past them, hugging shadows, moving like specters across frozen ground. When they reached the depot, they found crates of ammunition, fuel barrels, and ration packs stacked meticulously. Harris examined the layout quickly, memorizing positions of explosive materials, weak structural points, and exit routes. The sabotage would need to be surgical, enough to disrupt German supply lines but without unnecessary exposure. He placed timed charges on key fuel barrels and ammunition caches, setting them to detonate hours later when German patrols would be least prepared. With the sabotage underway, Harris signaled the retreat. The team retraced their path silently, moving through the valley and back into forest cover. They paused only when necessary, listening for the faintest sounds of pursuit. Hours later, they reached a concealed observation post near the ridge. From this vantage point, Harris could see the German response beginning. Patrols moved cautiously, confused by the absence of normal routines, and supply trucks stalled in narrow paths, unsure of whether it was a trap. Harris's pulse quickened. This was exactly the disruption they had hoped for. One small detachment, a few hours of risk, and they had delayed the enemy's counteroffensive significantly. But this was only the beginning. The next night brought a new challenge: the rescue of captured Allied scouts. German intelligence had apprehended several recon units, and their capture threatened to reveal sensitive positions and plans. Harris's orders were to locate the holding site and extract the prisoners with minimal engagement. The detachment moved under the cover of heavy fog, the cold air biting through their coats. Forest trails were slick with ice, and visibility was near zero. Harris navigated using a combination of maps, compass bearings, and memory from prior reconnaissance flights. After hours of careful movement, they located the enemy holding area, a repurposed farmhouse surrounded by barbed wire and sentry posts. The structure was lit dimly by lanterns, shadows of guards stretching across snow-covered fields. Harris studied the defenses. A frontal assault would be suicidal. The solution, as always, required ingenuity. Using a combination of diversionary tactics, smoke grenades, and quiet approaches, Harris's team created a gap in the perimeter. 2 soldiers scaled the fences, silently neutralizing sentries, while Harris and another man pried open the door. Inside, the prisoners were shackled but unharmed. With careful coordination, the team freed them and retraced their steps through the forest. At one point, a German patrol stumbled upon their retreat path. Harris made a split-second decision, using a fallen tree as a barricade, and directing the prisoners through an alternate route. The patrol fired, but the team was already hidden. By dawn, the rescued scouts were safely back with Allied lines, their gratitude palpable but tempered by the exhaustion and stress etched into every face. Harris took a moment to breathe. "One operation down," he whispered, "but the war is still raging." The following weeks became a blur of night raids, reconnaissance, and sabotage. Harris's unit disrupted supply lines, destroyed communication hubs, and gathered critical intelligence on German troop movements. Each mission required adaptive thinking, meticulous planning, and rapid improvisation. Soldiers learned to anticipate problems before they arose. Frozen rivers meant new paths, patrol rotations meant altered schedules, and shifting weather could turn a quiet forest into a deadly trap. During one mission, the detachment encountered an abandoned German workshop. Inside were partially assembled vehicles, weapons, and materials that could be repurposed. Harris's mechanical expertise became invaluable. He oversaw the modification of captured equipment, turning it into makeshift tools for future operations. Molotov cocktails were reinforced with metal casings. Engines were repaired using scavenged parts, and even simple vehicles were converted into mobile observation posts. Innovation and necessity merged seamlessly under Harris's direction. One particularly daring operation involved intercepting a German convoy transporting winter supplies. Harris's team learned of the convoy's route from intelligence reports. The forest trail it used was narrow, winding, and frozen solid, perfect for an ambush but deadly for missteps. Harris positioned the team along elevated ridges, using natural cover to conceal themselves. Explosives were set to create barriers, forcing the convoy into a pre-designated kill zone. The operation was executed flawlessly. The lead trucks were halted, soldiers surrendered without resistance, and supplies were seized without loss to Allied forces. Throughout these operations, Harris's leadership style became a balance of discipline and adaptability. He encouraged initiative within his team, allowing soldiers to take calculated risks, improvise solutions, and learn from each encounter. Mistakes were analyzed, not punished, fostering an environment where creativity was as valuable as courage. By the winter of 1945, Harris's detachment had become legendary behind enemy lines. German commanders referred to them in reports as ghosts of the Ardennes, unpredictable and relentless, appearing and disappearing without warning. Their actions not only disrupted operations, but also forced the enemy to divert troops and resources to counter them, relieving pressure on Allied frontline units. Harris reflected on the nature of their work. Each successful mission saved lives, accelerated strategic objectives, and demonstrated that small units, operating intelligently and creatively, could have an outsized impact on the broader war effort. Yet the psychological toll was immense. Soldiers lived in constant danger, slept in freezing conditions, and bore the weight of responsibility for the lives of their comrades. Morale required constant attention, humor, camaraderie, and shared purpose. Through it all, Harris maintained a simple philosophy: observe, adapt, act, and preserve life wherever possible. It was a principle that extended to the captured German soldiers. Many were disarmed and sent back to POW camps with minimal harm, a testament to Harris's understanding of warfare as not just destruction, but calculated strategy and human management. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces pushed further into German territory, Harris's operations had created significant tactical advantages. Key roads were cleared, supply lines disrupted, and enemy morale was fractured. His detachment's intelligence reports influenced larger Allied strategies, guiding armored columns, artillery strikes, and infantry movements. The legacy of these behind-the-lines operations became a model for future special operations forces. Lessons in small unit tactics, improvisation, and integration of intelligence and combat operations were codified into manuals, studied by generations of military planners. Harris, once a junior officer navigating frozen forests, had demonstrated that adaptability, ingenuity, and courage could redefine the battlefield. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Harris's detachment returned to Allied lines. They were exhausted, scarred, but profoundly proud of their contributions. Their missions had saved countless lives, accelerated the collapse of German defenses, and embodied the principle that even small, dedicated units could have an immense strategic impact. Harris looked back at the Ardennes forest, now quiet, its frost melting under spring sun. Every frozen river, snow-covered ridge, and hidden valley had been a theater of courage, ingenuity, and relentless effort. He understood that victory was not only measured by the ground gained, but by the lives preserved and the problems solved under the harshest conditions. In the months and years following, military historians would study the Ardennes operations. They would highlight not just the large-scale offensives, but also the critical work of small units operating behind enemy lines, missions that demonstrated that intellect, preparation, and courage could be as decisive as sheer firepower. Harris's detachment became emblematic of this philosophy, a testament to what could be achieved when soldiers were empowered to think, innovate, and act with precision. April 1945. The sun rose over the industrial heart of Germany, but the light was dimmed by smoke, steel, and ruin. The Ruhr Valley, once the engine of German industry, a sprawling network of factories, railways, and mines, had become a fortress of desperation. Allied forces encircled the region, cutting off supply lines and isolating the remaining German troops. The mission was straightforward in theory: capture the Ruhr, cripple Germany's industrial capacity, and hasten the end of the war. In practice, it was anything but simple. Lieutenant Colonel James Whittaker stood atop a slight rise overlooking the city of Essen. Through his binoculars, he could see the remnants of factories smoldering, rail lines twisted like metal vines, and columns of smoke marking destroyed supply depots. The German defenders were entrenched in reinforced buildings, underground bunkers, and fortified industrial complexes. Every factory, every warehouse, every chemical plant was a potential killing zone. Whittaker's orders were clear: advance rapidly, avoid unnecessary casualties, and neutralize resistance efficiently. But the Ruhr was a labyrinth, a city turned fortress, and every street, alley, and industrial yard concealed lethal threats. Our intelligence reports indicate pockets of German resistance here, Whittaker said, tracing lines on a map. Snipers, anti-tank weapons, and minefields are scattered throughout the industrial complexes. Casualty estimates could be high if we're not careful. We need innovation, teamwork, and careful reconnaissance. Anything less will cost lives we can't afford. He was speaking to his combined arms task force, a mixture of infantry, engineers, and armored units. The engineers, led by Major Richard Stein, were particularly crucial. Their mission: clear minefields, demolish fortified positions, and ensure tanks could advance without exposing crews to concentrated fire. Whittaker's plan relied heavily on coordination. Infantry would advance in staggered formations, supported by armor. Tanks would provide firepower, while engineers followed closely behind, neutralizing obstacles and creating paths through debris. Each unit had to act in concert. A misstep by a single squad could expose others to lethal fire. The first objective was the Krupp steel plant, a sprawling complex on the outskirts of Essen. It had been partially destroyed by Allied bombing, but German forces had fortified what remained. Whittaker's task force approached at dawn, the first light illuminating shattered windows, twisted girders, and smoke rising from smoldering warehouses. Reconnaissance teams moved forward cautiously, mapping enemy positions. They encountered mines buried beneath rubble and concealed machine gun nests hidden in office towers. Using portable mine detectors and manual probing, engineers cleared the paths for advancing infantry and tanks. The first engagement occurred near a loading yard. German snipers, operating from makeshift towers, opened fire as Allied infantry advanced. Whitaker ordered suppressing fire from tanks while infantry maneuvered to flank the snipers. The battle was tense and chaotic. Bullets ricocheted off steel beams, dust and smoke filled the air, and every decision had to be instantaneous. Meanwhile, Major Stein directed demolition teams to neutralize key barricades. Using a combination of explosives and cutting tools, they tore through reinforced gates, allowing armored vehicles to enter the complex. One engineer, Private First Class Henry Morales, rigged an improvised explosive charge that blew a steel gate clean off its hinges. The explosion reverberated through the plant, startling both friend and foe. Inside the plant, German defenders were entrenched but disorganized. Whitaker coordinated an assault. Infantry cleared floors methodically. Engineers disabled remaining machinery that could be used as defensive obstacles, and tanks provided covering fire. Movement was slow but deliberate, minimizing exposure to sniper fire and booby traps. By late afternoon, the Krupp steel plant was secured. Casualties were lighter than expected, a testament to careful planning and the integration of engineering expertise with combat operations. Whitaker noted this success, but reminded his officers that the Ruhr was only partially contained. Other industrial complexes, transportation hubs, and defensive strong points remained active. Over the next several days, the task force pushed deeper into the Ruhr. Each sector presented unique challenges. In some areas, German forces had created barricades of railway cars, debris, and industrial machinery. Tanks could not simply drive through. Engineers had to design and implement field-expedient solutions on the fly. One notable innovation came from Lieutenant David Harper, a young officer with a background in mechanical engineering. Observing the difficulty tanks had in maneuvering through collapsed rail yards, Harper devised a system of modular steel rollers, allowing armored vehicles to traverse uneven tracks without exposing vulnerable undersides. The improvisation proved effective, enabling tanks to advance while maintaining frontal armor orientation, an echo of lessons learned during earlier campaigns in Normandy. Infantry units faced urban combat that was methodical, grueling, and psychologically exhausting. Every building could conceal snipers. Every alley could be mined. Soldiers learned to move in coordinated pairs, clearing rooms with bayonets and pistols when necessary, using grenades judiciously. Engineers adapted quickly, rigging improvised bridging systems to cross collapsed rail lines and demolishing walls to create new avenues of advance. By mid-April, the Allied forces had encircled the Ruhr, effectively cutting off German troops from supplies and reinforcements. The siege relied not only on combat effectiveness, but also on psychological operations. Leaflets were dropped, broadcasts encouraged surrender, and targeted strikes demonstrated the futility of continued resistance. The combination of engineering ingenuity, tactical planning, and psychological pressure began to take effect. However, challenges persisted. German forces occasionally mounted counterattacks, exploiting narrow streets and fortified positions. Whitaker's task force responded with integrated defense. Artillery strikes were coordinated with infantry positioning, engineers reinforced chokepoints, and tanks provided mobile fire support. The Ruhr became a dynamic battlefield, with control shifting temporarily in localized skirmishes, but each engagement ultimately reinforced Allied dominance. One remarkable episode occurred in the city of Dortmund, where a factory complex had been converted into a defensive citadel. German forces had rigged the interior with explosives, intending to destroy the facility and block Allied advance. Major Stein's engineers conducted a daring operation. They infiltrated the building, identified and neutralized charges, and facilitated a controlled demolition of critical structural supports to allow safe passage for tanks and infantry. The operation was executed under enemy fire, but casualties were minimal due to meticulous planning and disciplined execution. The siege demonstrated a recurring theme: innovation under pressure. Soldiers and engineers frequently improvised solutions, combining knowledge, intuition, and available resources. Communication was key. Messengers, radios, and visual signals ensured coordination despite the chaos. As April drew to a close, the Ruhr's industrial capacity was effectively neutralized. Allied forces controlled key cities, transportation hubs, and supply lines. German troops, isolated and demoralized, began surrendering en masse. The siege had achieved its strategic objectives, crippling the industrial heart of Germany, accelerating the collapse of military operations, and facilitating the final push into central Germany. Whitaker observed the aftermath from a vantage point overlooking Essen. Factories were silent, railway lines destroyed or occupied, and smoke drifted lazily over smoldering ruins. The human cost had been significant, but the strategic gains were undeniable. Allied forces could now redirect resources, including armored divisions and logistical units, to the final phases of the European campaign. The lessons of the Ruhr siege were soon studied by military planners worldwide. It demonstrated the critical importance of combined arms operations, the integration of engineering and combat units, and the value of adaptive tactics in urban and industrial environments. Improvisation, ingenuity, and rapid decision-making proved as decisive as firepower. Lieutenant Colonel Whitaker, reflecting on the campaign, noted, "The Ruhr was more than a battlefield. It was a test of human ingenuity, endurance, and coordination. Soldiers who could think, engineers who could improvise, and commanders who could adapt made the difference. Victory was achieved not just by force, but by the ability to solve problems under the harshest conditions." As Allied forces advanced beyond the Ruhr towards central Germany, the lessons learned, improvised engineering solutions, adaptive urban combat tactics, and integration of intelligence with operational planning, would inform every subsequent operation. Soldiers carried with them the knowledge that even the most fortified positions could be overcome through careful planning, innovation, and the relentless application of skill and courage. By the time the Ruhr was fully secured, the remaining German military was in disarray. Allied forces could move swiftly toward the heart of Germany, with the knowledge that industrial resources were neutralized and resistance would be fragmented. The siege had shortened the duration of the conflict, reduced casualties in subsequent operations, and demonstrated the unparalleled value of adaptive problem-solving on the battlefield. April 16, 1945. The outskirts of Berlin were alive with the sound of artillery, the rumble of tanks, and the distant shriek of Luftwaffe planes making last-ditch sorties. Smoke hung low over the city like a suffocating blanket, the aftermath of relentless bombing campaigns over the past months. Every building bore scars, shattered windows, collapsed roofs, charred walls. The streets were strewn with rubble, twisted metal, and the occasional abandoned bicycle or cart, relics of a civilian population that had long fled or been caught in the crossfire. For the Allied forces, Berlin represented both a symbolic and strategic objective. The fall of the city meant the definitive end of Nazi control over Germany, the collapse of its military hierarchy, and the liberation of thousands trapped in the war-torn capital. But the challenge was immense. Unlike the Ruhr, Berlin was a dense urban environment. Streets were narrow, buildings multi-storied, and the defenders deeply entrenched. German forces had converted schools, factories, subway tunnels, and office blocks into fortified positions. They had rigged apartments with explosives, laid mines in alleyways, and positioned snipers in the upper floors of every intact structure. General Omar Bradley, overseeing the advance of the American units, had learned lessons from Normandy and the Ruhr. He emphasized combined arms, adaptive tactics, and innovation under pressure. Lieutenant Colonel James Whitaker, now seasoned by the siege of the Ruhr, was tasked with leading the Infantry Engineer Battalion into the city's western districts. His mission was simple in concept: secure the city block by block, neutralize German resistance, and pave the way for armored units to advance safely. In practice, it would be a labyrinthine nightmare. Whitaker surveyed the city from a makeshift command post in a partially destroyed office building. Through the binoculars, he could see the distant outlines of the Reichstag, still standing but scarred and surrounded by rubble. Smoke curled from fires across the city, obscuring lines of sight. Mortars periodically exploded in the distance, sending plumes of dust skyward. Our reconnaissance reports indicate strong German positions in the northern district, Whitaker said to his officers. Sniper nests, booby-trapped buildings, and reinforced barricades are everywhere. Casualty estimates could be high. We need innovation, teamwork, and adaptive thinking. Every decision counts. The task force moved forward cautiously. Infantry units advanced through narrow streets, moving in staggered formations to minimize vulnerability to sniper fire. Engineers followed closely, clearing mines, dismantling barricades, and neutralizing explosives rigged to buildings. Tanks, heavily armored but still vulnerable to Panzerfausts and anti-tank grenades, provided fire support from strategic positions. The first major engagement occurred near the district of Charlottenburg. German defenders had fortified the streets with overturned cars, barricades of furniture, and sections of collapsed masonry. Snipers fired from upper floors, and machine guns raked the streets below. Whitaker coordinated a dual approach: suppressive fire from tanks, simultaneous flanking maneuvers by infantry, and precise demolition work by engineers to clear paths. One engineer, Sergeant Henry Morales, demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. Faced with a barricade of reinforced steel doors and rubble blocking a narrow alley, he constructed an improvised lever system using steel pipes, sandbags, and pulleys. With careful coordination, the barricade was lifted and moved aside, allowing the infantry to advance without exposing themselves to German fire. The operation, though dangerous, was a perfect example of field-expedient engineering under extreme conditions. Inside buildings, combat was brutal. Infantry moved floor by floor, clearing rooms methodically. Snipers were neutralized with grenades or close-quarters engagements. Engineers identified and disarmed explosives, often under fire, and tanks provided covering fire through walls and windows. Civilians who remained in the city were evacuated when possible, though the chaos of urban combat made this difficult. By the third day, the battalion had secured several key blocks in western Berlin. Each victory came at a cost. Soldiers were exhausted, wounded, and psychologically strained. Whitaker emphasized rest and rotation, understanding that urban combat was as much a test of endurance as of skill. Innovation continued to play a critical role. Lieutenant David Harper, now an experienced field engineer, devised a method for breaching reinforced concrete walls without using large quantities of explosives. Using small, strategically placed charges combined with mechanical levers, crews could create doorways and passageways efficiently and safely. This technique allowed infantry to bypass heavily fortified entrances and surprise German defenders who had expected frontal assaults. By April 20, the battle intensified. Adolf Hitler remained holed up in the Führerbunker, issuing frantic orders and insisting on defense at all costs. German forces, though severely depleted, were fanatically committed to resisting the Allied advance. The streets became death traps, with every intersection potentially concealing ambushes or mines. Whitaker's task force encountered one of the most challenging obstacles of the campaign: a series of interconnected factories rigged with explosives and defended by remnants of the German army and SS units. The factories formed a maze of corridors, machinery, and storage rooms filled with flammable materials. One wrong step could trigger catastrophic explosions. Engineers worked with meticulous care, often crawling through narrow spaces to locate charges. Private First-Class Morales, Lieutenant Harper, and a team of sappers spent hours identifying wiring patterns and explosive placements. Improvised shields made from steel plates and debris were used to protect personnel as they disabled charges. The operation required patience, precision, and nerves of steel. Meanwhile, infantry moved cautiously through cleared corridors, supported by tanks that provided mobile cover and firepower. German defenders attempted counterattacks, but the integrated approach of combined arms, engineering expertise, and tactical innovation allowed Whitaker's units to maintain momentum. A critical breakthrough occurred when the battalion reached the Berlin Zoo district. German forces had converted the area into a fortified stronghold, utilizing enclosures, cages, and buildings as defensive positions. Tanks, unable to maneuver through narrow streets, required engineers to create temporary passageways by demolishing walls and barricades strategically. Improvised ramps and platforms allowed armored units to gain advantageous firing positions, neutralizing German positions that had previously held the district for days. Throughout the battle, communication and coordination were essential. Radios, runners, and visual signals ensured that infantry, engineers, and tanks could operate in concert. Mistimed actions or miscommunication could result in friendly fire or expose units to German ambushes. Whitaker emphasized discipline and constant situational awareness, understanding that urban combat demanded precision and adaptability.